A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 6. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I lived because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which the ancestors ate, and they died, but the one who eats this bread will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in a synagogue at Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "The teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the beginning who were the ones who did not believe and who was the one who would betray him. And he said, "For this reason, I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We've come to believe, and we know that you are the Holy One of God." For sacred words of challenge and encouragement.
Thanks be to God. May we reflect together in the name of God, the bread of life. Amen. Now, in a moment, I'm going to share in conversation on our behalf with our guest speaker this morning, Will Small. And if Will's around for a little bit longer, do have a word with him. Fantastic person that we have in our midst. Before doing so, however, I'm going to ask this question, which is related to our gospel reading this morning, which you need to read with spiritual eyes rather than literally. Otherwise, you get into the same trouble that Jesus' hearers did at the time. Because that passage, like many in John's, to be read with spiritual, even mystical eyes, comes from John's Bread of Life discourse. It's a question to ponder as individuals and as a body together. The question is this: what is the bread of life for you, for us, and for others today? What is the bread of life for you, for us, and for others today? And how do we share it? That's the invitation of this gospel. Another way of putting it is to say, how are we to be evangelical and to be evangelists today? Because the words evangelical and evangelist, especially with a small e, big E is something different perhaps, are often abused and misused today. They're too easily associated, aren't they, with particular Christian traditions, formulations, and practices. And maybe I suspect this congregation has steered a little bit clear of them in recent decades. But in my view, when we reflect on biblical passages like that today, we cannot remove them from a living Christian faith, at least with a small e for evangel. Rather, we have to reclaim and renew them, because the word evangel or evangelion in Greek simply means good news. And if we're not a people of good news, a people of evangelion, then what are we doing? What, to pick up our gospel theme with which we've travelled over recent weeks, what is the bread of life for us today? This good news, the bread that feeds us and can feed the world. That's the core question for our lives and faith and world now and for the future. After all, as the old saying puts it wonderfully, evangelism, being truly evangelical, sharing the evangelion, sharing good news, is really only about a beggar telling others where to find food. You and I are like beggars, seeking bread and seeking, when we discover some of it, to share it and point it out for others. So what does that bread look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like to you? And how might we share this bread that feeds us together with one another and with others? So I said earlier with the gospel reading that's best to read with spiritual eyes, or you could say with poetic eyes. Now some of us sort of are aware and appreciate poetry. Some people are poets. So in a moment I'm going to ask Will to offer us one of his poems. And if you're very lucky, because there's a handful of them at the back, aren't there? You might be able to get hold of one of Will's books as well. And if you're very lucky, you might write something in it like he did for me as well. Because to enter into this passage, to enter into it with spiritual eyes, poetically to find, and all of this language of bread of life is about that. But it comes down to, where do we find good news for ourselves, together, and for others in the days? In other words, how can we be better evangelicals than those perhaps who sometimes like to call themselves evangelicals? So I'm going to ask Will to begin. I might turn this on. To lead us with one of his poems, and then I'm going to have a little chat with him, and then we might have another poem at the end. Okay.
Well, good morning. Lovely to be with you this morning, and thank you for the warm welcome. There's a poem called "He Always Comes in Skin." Jesus came to me, wearing the rocks and the water and the bark as skin. It seems he always comes in skin. I didn't notice at first, until I saw the scars in his side, the marks inflicted by our addiction to the nails. I, like Thomas, came, tail between my legs, with questions. Is it really you? Have you swapped your donkey for a chariot yet? Are you here to divide the sheep and the goats? Jesus asked me to place my fingers in the wounds. I touched the fractured earth beneath my feet, a portrait of the weary Saviour we continue to exploit, to crucify, to praise. My Lord and my God. We touched, skin to skin. Jesus wept, and I with him.
Thank you, Will, for sharing some of your own poetry. You've been on a journey. We're all on journeys, aren't we? But I know your spiritual journey, which is how you come to, talk about things like spiritual misfits. What are the main things in your own life journey that have led you to where you are now, and have invited you into asking bigger questions or deeper questions, and to work with others as you are now?
Well, it'll be the abridged version, as our stories always are when we share them. It's funny that you're just talking about, sort of the different contested meanings of the word evangelical. And when I was a young person, I certainly would have identified strongly as a capital E evangelical who knew the truth with absolute certainty. I grew up in Canberra, part of a big family, 5 siblings, so 6 kids, and my parents, had a very earnest faith, and raised all of us within it. And I suppose when I was in high school, in those sort of early teenage formative years, I went to a small, capital E evangelical Christian school, and I had a faith that was confident, if not arrogant, and I definitely thought I knew how everything in the universe worked. And I was quite happy to tell other people that I knew that. And I was on a mission to save the world. Perhaps I didn't view myself as a beggar who'd found bread. I was a little bit better than that, maybe, in my mind. But I certainly had something to share. And I suppose as the years went on, little cracks began to appear in my sort of perfect worldview. I went to uni and studied philosophy, and the evangelicals will tell you you're not supposed to do that because that can kind of threaten some of the, this sort of really tightly held together worldview. So while I was at university, I was studying philosophy and English literature, but at the same time, in contrast with that, someone asked me to start going with them on the weekends into the Juvenile Justice Centre. They knew that I was into poetry, I was into hip-hop music, into rap, and they said, why don't you come along and share some of your words with these young offenders? And so, quite a contrast to think about sitting in a kind of university tutorial talking about whether or not, we exist, and then going in and sitting with young people as young as 13, 14 years old who statistically are very likely to re-offend and to spend their life in prison. And so sitting with some of those young people began to really form a crack in my worldview, because I began to wonder what would happen if some of these young guys came to the church that I go to on a Sunday, if they got released and came along. How would that play out? And it really started to challenge some of my assumptions, as well as, I suppose, what I saw were the assumptions of our community. And so that was one kind of moment of the cracks beginning to show. And then I moved from Canberra to the Central Coast, where I now live, about 11 or 12 years ago. And I was working as a youth worker, because with a degree in English and philosophy, it's pretty hard to figure out what to do with that. So I went into youth work and tried to integrate my love of creativity, of poetry, again, of hip-hop music, with young people who were maybe doing it tough for one reason or another. And I was working with the Salvos, and that was great. And a little way into that, I sort of got offered to join the pastoral team at the church that I was a part of, which is a Baptist church on the coast. And so took on a part-time role at the church. So sort of doing my youth work role, and then I was working with the young adults at the church. And what I found is, from the time when that kind of began, over the next sort of 5 years or so, I noticed that a number of my friends, began to kind of quietly slip out of church. Whether it was to do with the church's kind of treatment of queer people, whether it was to do with questions they had that they didn't feel they could openly ask in a Sunday service sort of setting. And I was sort of managing my own kind of wrestle as I was reading the Bible, trying to preach the Word of God, and also asking questions around, well, God sometimes seems really violent, and is some of this actually good news? And the very confident faith that I had, I guess, inherited was beginning to become a lot less confident. And so I was sort of managing kind of how I presented, that in a public way, while also privately probably having my own kind of dark night of the soul, and wondering, is the God that I've believed in throughout my life actually good, or actually do I actually sort of understand truth with as much confidence as I had thought? And then life goes on, and you encounter different things that again cause you to see things in different lights. Parenting has been a big one for me. When my first of my 3 sons was born, he had a very rough start to life, and we were pretty run ragged, just absolute sleepless 12 months. We started our journey with him in the NICU, in the newborn intensive care unit, and yeah, it's quite an intense journey, and that again raised a lot of questions for me. I remember, I don't know if anybody's ever had this experience, but in the middle of the night, I'll be holding my screaming son, crying out to God with some choice language to make this baby stop crying, while also thinking, but if you did answer that prayer, and we live in the world we live in, where people are starving, where wars are being fought, where horrendous things are happening, well, it's like I don't want you to answer that prayer, because that would raise even bigger questions. So my faith was kind of unraveling. And yet, I suppose, just like what I had encountered with those young guys in the Juvenile Justice Centre, I continued to find Christ in unexpected places. God had broken out of my box, and yet I found Christ in people who were often excluded or marginalised from the church, and yet when I sat with them, I sensed the presence of love and goodness, and that those things that I had always believed, that I had seen in my folks and their faith, did continue to resonate and remain true. And so, yeah, this could be a very long story, but to wrap it up, I began to sort of, look for ways to spend more time outside of the walls of the, I guess, institutional or mainstream church, but to absolutely continue to try and sit with people in spaces where we could explore those big questions around what love looks like and what it looks like when we encounter the divine in unexpected places.
Thank you. There's so much there, and that's rich. We'd hopefully chat further in future. So that leads on nicely, actually, into the project you have and the work you do in terms of spiritual misfits. So I was going to ask you, tell us a little bit about that and what bread you found in that, as with all the fragments, as it were, and questions that are around.
Yeah. So after about 5 years working at the church where I was working, I did begin to ask, and I had very good relationships there with the leadership team and still have a lot of love and respect for the people in that community. But I did begin to ask some questions out loud around, could I try with a few friends to create a space where all my friends who have left church but haven't necessarily left their faith, if anything, it's like they're on the side of the road with a flat tire and no one's ever told them that you can change the tires. It's okay for this faith thing to change. I began to ask, could we try and create a space that might work for some of those people? And there's a lot of different ways you can feel like a misfit, right? There are a lot of different ways people can feel on the edge, whether it's to do with their physical or mental health, whether it's to do with gender and sexuality, whether it's to do, again, with sort of the questions that you're supposed to have confident answers to no longer kind of making sense. So we basically, at the beginning of 2020, we invited around 25 of our friends who had kind of left church but still had some open-ended questions. We invited them around for a barbecue and we said, we want to try and do something different. And then 2020 unrolled like it did. And so our visions of starting this kind of church around the table became church around the digital table. And we were in the position of everyone else trying to figure out how to build community online. But we kind of persevered through that. And I feel like, about 4 years on, the community that we lead is called Meeting Ground, and it really is a place for the kind of spiritual refugees or the spiritually confused and maybe still seeking. And so we kind of do gather in homes or in public spaces, parks, things like that, and we try to find the best of the tradition while kind of helping people to let go of some of the baggage that may have become attached to it. We're aware, though, that we can only really do that in the way that we want to do it with a pretty small number of people, and yet we know that there are many people in lots of places that feel like a misfit, that may feel alone, that may feel like nobody sees them, and so we began to create a podcast and sort of do some online kind of creative work. And that podcast has people that listen all over Australia, as well as, a few internationals. And we've had some absolutely wonderful guests, including Joe, which has been excellent, sort of honestly sharing their stories and often starting with that kind of question of what do you resonate with this idea of ever feeling like a spiritual misfit, and where has that led you over time? So, I feel very privileged to be able to do that work. And for me, making a podcast is really just a chance to continue to have conversations with interesting people who continue to open my eyes to new ways of understanding the tradition and where the Spirit is moving today.
Thank you. One more question. I'm always struck by the way in which the renewal usually comes through spiritual misfits, whether or not in the tradition. And Jesus, was a bit of a spiritual misfit in his own time. And that's part of my hope. What I see around is that the church is still flailing around denominationally and institutionally, trying to sort of save part of the old empire and the old ways of thinking. And that maybe we need to be, whilst we continue, right, this building here and what we're about here is keeping going things that we don't need to lose, the riches of the past, but we do need to be finding new ways forward. And so your work and the work of others I see is really encouraging to me. What are your own spiritual hopes and dreams for the future?
Yeah, it's a big question. I'm often trying to grapple with that question of what is the best of the ancient tradition and what is the unrealized thing that awaits us that we haven't discovered yet. And I think that there is something to trying to hold that tension, to not, kind of discarding everything that has come before us and yet not holding on so tightly to everything that has come before us that we fail to see what may be ahead of us. And so I do think that the future church must look very different to what it looks like currently, as we see certain forms of it maybe passing away, maybe struggling in the death throes. There's a lot that I'm quite happy to leave behind, and yet my hopes and dreams for the future are for communities where people feel richly connected to something bigger than themselves. I have this kind of joke of a last name. My last name is Small, so I'm constantly reminded that in the grand scheme of things, I am small and rather insignificant. But being small can be a very liberating thing when you realise that you don't have to pretend to be bigger than you are, but you are connected to something bigger than you are. And so that's the kind of thing I dream about for the future, is how in such an overwhelming world that we live in right now, how can we help people to feel kind of okay with their smallness, maybe their relative helplessness in the face of some of the big challenges that we have, but to feel a deep sense of connection to community that helps to empower them, that helps them to get out of bed, that helps them to have hope for the world. And so there's lots of different ways that could look. I think that there is a lot of ground to be explored in terms of the hybrid of physical communities that do make the most of the digital kind of technology available to us. We've just started something in our little community called the Digital Monastery, where a few times a week, we obviously don't live in a monastery and none of our lives look particularly monastic, but I love the idea that if you did live in a monastery, you've got regular times living in community where there is like a bell that dings and you can come out for some common prayer. And so we do that a few times just with a WhatsApp call. We've got a few set times during the week. Call the group, it's 5 to 10 minutes, here's some reading, and go on with your life. I think in the modern world where people are often quite disconnected and it's hard to feel really part of community, that's just a little way of going, how could we kind of use the best of what we have available to build in some more rhythms that ground us. Lots of things that I hope and dream for, but at the end of the day, I constantly hope for a church where we continue to invite in or to go out to every group that we have, perhaps without realising it, left on the outside. There's always a group of people that we have either pushed or left outside of the spaces that we create. And I think the future of the church has to constantly be asking, who have we intentionally or unintentionally done that to, and how can we redefine who we are until everyone fits and everyone belongs. I kind of think that the idea of calling people spiritual misfits is a bit of a joke in a way, because I think everyone fits, everyone belongs. That's what I believe at the core. But there's a lot of different ways that we can feel like we don't belong, and the work that we can do to help people to unfeel that, to feel a deep sense of belonging is what I try and spend my energy on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation, inviting me into your conversation for us. And I hope this will continue. I know you're in conversation with others, creative younger people and some older people in the Uniting Church, and trying to work out ways in which we can be a community that, finds bread and shares bread with others. And beggars are small people as well, aren't they? And vulnerable in that journey. So I hope you'll be able to travel with us as well and with others as we take these steps along the way. So I'm going to ask you to read one more poem, and then we'll pray.
Yeah. Well, this book that I wrote last year is called Poems for When the World is Ending. And they're actually poems I wrote between 2019, sort of the black summer bushfires, and the end of 2022. And between, those dates, fires, floods, a global pandemic, the erosion of democracy, and alongside that, my third child was born, and magnolias grew over my neighbour's fence, and whales migrated. Life on planet Earth is a wildly paradoxical thing, filled with grief and joy, and wounds and wonder. And so the poem has what might seem like the book has kind of a depressing sounding title, Poems for When the World is Ending, but it's also about the fact that even when it feels like the world is ending, human beings continue to be creative, continue to write and paint and compose. So this is the first poem in the book, and it's called The Apocalypse Next Door. The world is always ending. for someone. There is always an apocalypse next door. You don't need X-ray vision to peer beneath the skin of things. Across the road from my house, a woman paces, mumbles, yells curses at a world gone mad. Encores of this dramatic monologue she has performed many times for the red and yellow littered bins lined up and listening. I tell myself she is a little off, but perhaps her response is the logical one in a world of everyday apocalypses. Easy to dismiss the long lineage of doomsday sayers who got their dates mixed up, but maybe their dates were correct. Their prophecies just lacked particularity. The end of the world plays on repeat. Some babes are born without heartbeats. Others raised by hard streets get caged like sardines before age 18. Young trans lives take early exits in the wake of dehumanizing and venomous rhetoric. Forests razed, habitats in tatters, to maintain unnecessary and excessive human habits. The world is always ending for someone. Thing is, though, you can watch it broadcast live from across the road, or you can wander into someone else's apocalypse and let them know they're not alone. And the reason I share that poem with you is because to me that is what the incarnation is a picture of, that the story that we have is not of a distant God who stands by and kind of watches the carnage unfold, but this is a God who enters every place of suffering in solidarity, and that's the invitation for us as well, to enter into any situation where there is suffering and to be a presence of companionship and solidarity and love. Thank you.
Thank you.